are entering a timeline not found in any textbook, a place where history bent left when it could have turned right, where great empires stumble, unknown revolutions rise, and the familiar becomes strange. This is the border between what was and what could have been. Welcome to Glitchology, a realm of fractured timelines, impossible outcomes, and the haunting logic of the what if. Each episode, we take one thread of reality and pull. Somewhere, in a timeline not our own, the story continued, and you are the lucky spectator of what could have been. London, 1970. The band that changed the world has played its final chord, or have they? In this version of history, the rooftop never closed. The letters were never signed. The dreams, the riffs, the revolutions continued. This isn't just a song stuck on repeat. It's a universe where Lennon, McCartney, Harrison, and Starr kept turning the dial of culture together. Get ready for our hosts, Valentina and Nico, to be your guides through this alternate harmony, where every Beatle beat echoes into a future that never was, but maybe should have been. So tune your ears, twist your mind, and get ready to imagine the B-side of history.
Today, we're digging into something huge in music history, the breakup of the Beatles. But we're not just retelling the old story. We're exploring an alternate path. Based on the sources you sent us, articles, research, your notes, what if they didn't break up in that messy way? What if things went differently?
Exactly. And our goal here in this deep dive is to really unpack the insights from these materials you've gathered. We want to understand the key moments, the surprising turns this alternate history suggests, and, well, guide you through this fascinating what if.
Because the real story, the 1970 split, it wasn't simple, was it?
Oh, not at all. It was a whole tangle of things. Personal issues, business problems, just human stuff.
Right. And the sources seem to point to about 5 main theories for why it really happened. Maybe we should quickly run through those first, just to set the stage for how things could have changed.
Good idea. Let's lay out the real-world setup according to these sources. So first, and maybe the foundational crack, was Brian Epstein dying in '67.
Their manager, the guy who kept it all together, yeah.
Absolutely. He was their manager, sure, but also their buffer, their peacemaker. Without him, they were suddenly dealing with the chaos of Apple Corps, their own business empire, and, no referee when they disagreed.
Okay, so that loss leaves a huge hole, which leads right into the next big issue.
The fight over who should manage them.
Yes. Paul wanted the Eastmans, his father-in-law's firm.
But the other three, they went with Alan Klein, who was well known for being pretty aggressive, sharp.
But Paul really didn't trust him.
Not one bit. And the sources really detail this, how the others overruled Paul. It created this huge split, not just about management, but financially, artistically.
And that's what eventually led Paul to sue the others in '71, to break up the partnership.
Yeah, he felt backed into a corner. That lawsuit is pretty much the final nail in the coffin for the original band structure.
Okay, so losing their guide, fighting over the replacement.
Yeah.
What else was pulling them apart?
Well, the music itself. Creative differences.
Right. By the late '60s, they weren't really one band musically anymore, were they?
Not really. You had Lennon going raw, political, McCartney refining that incredible melodic pop sense.
George finally stepping up with his spiritual Eastern influence stuff.
And Ringo sort of caught in the middle, trying to hold it together.
You can hear it on the White Album, can't you? Working separately.
Definitely. Lennon doing Julia alone, Paul playing drums on back in the USSR, because Ringo had actually quit for a bit.
Wow, I forgot about that.
And then the Let It Be sessions. Engineer Jeff Emmerich apparently described the atmosphere as just toxic.
Oof. So the joy was gone.
It seems like it. Which brings us to the fourth reason, the one everyone talks about, Yoko Ono.
Okay.
Her constant presence definitely broke their old no outsiders rule in the studio, and yeah, it caused friction.
But the sources don't blame her for the split.
No, the key point here is that she was more of a symptom, not the actual disease.
A catalyst, maybe?
That's a good way to put it. The argument in the material is that Lennon was already pulling away, looking for something else, and Yoko represented that new path for him.
Paul even said later, didn't he, something like she didn't break up the group.
But John was definitely ready to go.
Yeah. He helped facilitate something that was probably going to happen anyway.
Okay, so not the sole cause. And the final reason.
Just sheer burnout, fame fatigue, the incredible crushing weight of being the Beatles for a decade.
Living in that bubble, that cultural storm.
Exactly. Constant recording, the madness of the early tours, changing personal lives, the pressure of the myth. The sources describe this deep exhaustion.
John's quote about it being like a marriage gone wrong.
Nobody wanted to be the first to walk out.
It really sums up that sense of paralysis and fatigue, doesn't it?
So pulling it all together from the sources, it wasn't one thing. It was this perfect storm: grief, business conflicts, creative evolution, personal changes, just being worn out. They'd outgrown the legend.
But, and this is where your notes get really interesting, the sources ask, what if just one of those elements had shifted slightly in 1970? What if they'd found a different way?
Right. Which leads us into this alternate timeline, the shift. The sources imagine a 1970 where, yeah, they're fractured, but something changes. They reach a hard-won detente.
And the crucial change hinges on John Lennon. In real life, September 69, he tells the others privately, I want a divorce. It's final.
Which eventually leads to Paul's public announcement in April 70.
All right. But in this version of events, that conversation goes differently. Lennon still drops the bombshell, but instead of saying, I'm out for good, he suggests a sabbatical.
Like a break, a pause.
Yeah, 1-year pause. It's not a promise to stay forever, but critically, it's not slamming the door shut either.
How do the others react in this scenario?
George is apparently indifferent. Ringo just kind of nods. And Paul, though probably gutted, reluctantly agrees.
There's a key line exchanged, isn't there?
Yes. The source material highlights Paul saying something like, fine, but don't make it permanent. And John shoots back, only if you don't.
Wow. That's fragile. But it leaves the door open just a crack.
Just enough.
Yeah.
And that tiny opening allows for Paul McCartney's pivot.
Because in reality, his first solo album, McCartney, felt like him going his own way.
It did. Recorded in secret, very DIY. But here, that album essentially gets shelved. The songs exist, like Maybe I'm Amazed, every night.
And Ringo plays a role.
A huge one, according to the sources. He hears some of these raw tracks Paul's working on. And Ringo, being Ringo, sees the pain, but also sees the music. He urges Paul to share them.
Not as a solo statement, but maybe as a way back in.
Exactly, to re-engage. And the sources describe Lennon hearing, Maybe I'm Amazed, and actually being impressed. Not dismissive, but saying, that's good, let's put it on the next one.
That's a big moment.
It is. It validates Paul, and suddenly those solo tracks become potential building blocks for a new Beatles record, if they rework them together.
So Paul's music becomes a bridge instead of an exit ramp. What about George? He had that huge stash of songs.
He still does. The stuff that became All Things Must Pass. In these tentative 1970 sessions, he plays some demos. Lennon likes what he hears. And Paul, maybe humbled a bit, suggests they actually try arranging one of George's songs, Let It Down, as a band.
And there was that agreement, no vetoes.
Crucial. That promise that his songs would get a real hearing is what keeps George in the room, even though he's skeptical. Just rehearsing something like All Things Must Pass together sparks a little bit of that old collaborative feeling.
And Ringo's just there through all of it.
Absolutely essential, the sources stress. He's the emotional glue now, suggesting tea breaks when John and Paul argue, taking George for a drink when he looks like he's about to bolt, reminding them why they started when the business talk gets heavy. He just keeps them connected, barely but long enough.
And speaking of business, they finally sort out the management mess.
They do. After months of deadlock, realizing the chaos Klein versus Eastman caused, they agree to hire a neutral third-party manager, someone professional, focused just on the business side, not tied to any of them personally.
Which stabilizes Apple Corps.
Take some pressure off, lets them actually think about music again.
So end of 1970 in this timeline. No public breakup, no lawsuits yet, just quiet.
Yeah, an announcement about a new creative chapter. No big tour plans. Fans are wary but hopeful. It wasn't magic, the sources say. It was really hard work. But they got through it.
Okay, so they survived 1970. What comes out of this? The 1971 album.
Right. A self-titled return, The Beatles, released in 1971. They booked studio time quietly, EMI, October to December 1970. The sources emphasize it wasn't this huge hyped comeback, just them tentatively making music again.
And the sound is different, more mature maybe?
Definitely described as mature, stripped down. A real contrast to the tension of Abbey Road or the mess around Let It Be. Think acoustic guitars, electric piano, simpler drums. The goal was honesty, craft, not necessarily groundbreaking innovation.
Kind of reflecting the mood of 71, that post-60s introspection.
Exactly. It fits with that folk rock, singer-songwriter vibe.
Yeah.
James Taylor, Carole King. They weren't leading the pack, maybe, but they were part of that sound.
Let's talk about who brought what to this album, according to the hypothetical track list in the sources. John.
John brings songs that feel like precursors to Imagine. Jealous Guy is there, but reworked with Paul's harmonies, adding this different layer. Oh My Love is really stripped back, with George playing slide guitar. Very emotionally open stuff.
And Paul uses those tracks he'd originally done for his solo album.
Yeah. Maybe I'm Amazed gets a full band treatment. John on piano, George on slide, Ringo's drumming. Apparently sounds warmer, more connected than the solo demo. Acoustic things like Every Night. Less flashy guitar, more focus on the song itself.
And George finally gets his space.
Big time. He brings in songs from that All Things Must Pass backlog. Isn't It a Pity is mentioned as the album's emotional core, this slow-building epic. Beware of Darkness as well. Sessions weren't always smooth for him, the sources say, but he was being heard.
And Ringo.
He gets his track, It Don't Come Easy, co-written with George, recorded fast, live-sounding. It apparently closes side A, sort of a nod to his steady presence.
So the track list in the source material is side A, Jealous Guy, Maybe I'm Amazed, Isn't It a Pity, It Don't Come Easy, Every Night. Side B, Oh My Love, Beware of Darkness, That Would Be Something, Look at Me, and an acoustic reprise of All Things Must Pass.
That's the one outlined, and the album comes out November 71. Minimal promotion, simple white cover.
And it does well commercially.
Yeah, #1 UK, #2 in the US. Carole King's Tapestry was huge that year. So successful, but maybe not the culture-shattering event some might have expected.
What did the critics think?
Mixed, according to sources. Rolling Stone called it beautiful but burdened by its own caution. Other reviews mentioned it being a record for grown-ups or a return and not a rebirth.
But listeners connected with it, especially older fans.
It seems so. They responded to the honesty, the maturity. It wasn't seen later as some lost classic, but as this important moment. Proof that maybe reconciliation through art was possible. A quiet second chapter.
So the album's out there. How does the world react to the Beatles not being broken up?
The sources describe it as more of a murmur than a roar. People bought it, definitely. There was still this global reverence to Japan, Germany, France. Radio played the singles.
Debates in dorm rooms, I bet.
Oh, yeah. And that Guardian quote captures it. It sounds like them, but like they've been to war and back. It resonated with people trying to figure out the 70s.
And the critics in 71, they were kind of reassessing the whole 60s thing anyway, weren't they?
Right. It was an inflection point. And this album didn't get a free pass. Rolling Stone notably praised George's songs, but thought Paul's were maybe too safe.
And then there was that Jan Wenner interview with Lennon in December 71.
Yeah, that definitely set a tone. Lennon being Lennon sharp, honest, contradictory. He called the album good, not great. Push back against any nostalgia.
Didn't he say something about whether they'd do another one?
He did? Maybe. Depends if we remember why. Or if we just become the Rolling Stones in tuxedos. Caused a stir. Made people wonder how long this truce would last.
Paul, though, he kept quiet.
Pretty much. Avoided big interviews, let the music speak. Maybe still wary from being blamed for the breakup in 70. But the press created narratives anyway. The diplomat and the dissenter. Paul as the architect of restoration.
Which wasn't entirely fair, based on this alternate history.
No. The sources mentioned his private frustration, like, I wanted us to keep going, now I'm the suit again.
But George's profile really rose with this album.
Absolutely. Critics started seeing him not as the quiet Beatle, but as maybe the soul of the band now. Enemy even called him the unspoken leader.
Yeah, he downplayed it.
Yeah, his quote was something like, I didn't lead anything, I just didn't hold anything back this time. Then he kind of retreated back into his own projects.
And Ringo just kept being Ringo.
Steady, reliable Ringo. It Don't Come Easy was a hit. That BBC quote sums him up. If keeping everyone in the same room gets me a song on the record, I'll keep doing it. It's cheaper than therapy. He was seen as just essential.
So early 72, the album's out. It's sold well, got nominated for a Grammy. It exists, a fragile piece.
Like a possibility, yeah. A pause button hit on the breakup. A confession, almost.
Okay, so they navigate 71. What about 72, 73? The sources call this phase the Beatles Ltd, like a cooperative.
That's exactly the idea. They weren't a tight band anymore. More like a collective of individuals orbiting a shared history and business structure. A constellation, the sources call it.
With Apple Corps under new management as the stable center.
Right. Apple didn't implode. It became this smaller, functional production house, managing their joint affairs but also supporting their individual projects and even some outside ones, gave them structure but also freedom.
How did that work for them individual? George, for instance.
He releases living in the material world, just like in our timeline.
But with a twist.
Yeah, Paul plays on it, bass, harmonies on a couple of tracks.
Yeah.
And critics noted it Paul contributing as a fellow musician, not trying to take over. George apparently felt genuinely supported this time.
How about John? Still the activist.
Very much so. But the sources suggest it's framed differently because he's still connected to Apple.
Yeah.
Sometime in New York City, still comes out, still political.
But released under the Apple umbrella?
Yes. Maybe marketed as the Beatles Circle or something similar. A political statement from a founding voice. It perhaps softens the edges slightly, gives it institutional weight. George still opts out, showing individual choice.
So his activism isn't quite as isolating.
Potentially less so.
Mm-hmm.
He might do events with Apple's backing. Maybe Ringo shows up sometimes. The sources speculate this might even make him less of a target for surveillance than he was in reality. He becomes a model for artists wanting to speak out without burning bridges.
And Paul. No wings in this timeline. That's huge.
Massive difference.
Mm-hmm.
He doesn't need to form a new band to assert himself. His best solo stuff went into the '71 album. Now he releases music as Paul McCartney and Friends through Apple.
Like Highland Afternoon in '73.
Yeah, described as folk pop, quieter. Lennon and Ringo might contribute. Modest charts, but good reviews. He evolves into this respected elder statesman, the storyteller.
And Ringo's the connector.
The ultimate connector. Plays on everyone's sessions. His own solo album, Photograph in '73, is apparently the biggest hit from any of them during this period. George co-writes, Paul helps out. Lennon jokes he deserves an award just for keeping them talking. Ringo's just likable. The human face of the Beatles circle.
And they still got together occasionally, but not for full albums.
Right. These sort of annual retreats, the sources call them. Maybe yield a couple of tracks for a compilation or a soundtrack. A Lennon-McCartney duet, Window Seat, a George track with everyone on it, Sunlight Through Glass. Fans look forward to these little gifts.
So the Beatles brand by '73 isn't a band, it's an ecosystem.
Yeah, an institution, a label, a production house,
Yeah.
a carefully managed myth. Apple is releasing diverse stuff. Paul apparently suggests a children's line. Their influence is less about dominating, more ambient. Scale
Yeah.
the benchmark.
So end of '73. No big reunion album, no tour, but they're still there, functioning differently.
Exactly. Not bandmates in the old sense. A cooperative of legends linked by history and business, but free to follow their own paths. Nothing left to prove as a group.
How did that continued existence, even loosely, affect the culture from '72 to '75? The sources talk about quiet power.
It changed the narrative. Instead of a messy end, it was a story of evolution, longevity. It made the idea of a band more fluid. They weren't constantly in the headlines, but their presence was felt.
And Paul not forming Wings had big knock-on effects.
Huge. No need to prove independence that way. He records under his own name via Apple, doesn't tour arenas until much later, always billed as Paul McCartney of the Beatles.
And that vacuum he might have filled with Wings.
Artists like Elton John, Billy Joel step into it more prominently. EMI's resources might go to bands like Queen earlier. Paul remains a Beatle, the quiet craftsman, the one who stayed, as the sources put it.
John's activism also plays out within that structure.
Still a disruptor, but tethered. Sometime in New York City, released via Apple, perhaps makes the message feel less like a solo rant, more like a statement from within the establishment, weirdly. Apple's messaging could emphasize dialogue.
Makes him less isolated.
Possibly. He does panels, benefits, maybe with some subtle Apple or bandmate endorsement. Sources suggest maybe less intense FBI focus. He shows later artists you can be political without totally rejecting your past.
And Apple itself thrives, becomes innovative.
Avoids the real-world collapse. Under neutral management, it becomes a smart, lean, creative hub. Restructures into different divisions, records, film, publishing. Starts experimenting with video early, like music docs in '73. Positions itself well for the MTV era later.
And this longevity helps legitimize the whole idea of the aging rock star.
Absolutely. Before them, rockers over 30 were almost a joke. Their continuing, evolving presence gives permission for Dylan, Mitchell, Bowie, others to have long, respected careers. It makes longevity cool. The story doesn't end in flames.
They couldn't stop glam or punk or disco, though.
No, they didn't dominate the mid-'70s charts, but they influenced the context. Glam took cues from their album art focus. Disco learned from their global marketing. Punk defined itself against them, but still used the album format they perfected. They provided the structure, the background radiation.
So by '75, they're not the main event, but they're still fundamental.
An anchor, but not an anchor chain. stabilizing their own paths, legitimizing aging in rock, reshaping the industry, giving artists permission to evolve or step back. Not the loudest, but the measure. Architects, not gods.
Which leads us to 1974-75. The sources call this the last attempt, but it sounds less like a big blow-up and more like things just petering out. Drift without detonation.
Yeah, the structure's there, but the collaborative energy is just gone. Not hatred, the sources emphasize, just entropy. Fatigue sets in. No big fights, just silence, missed calls, sessions that don't quite happen.
And Lennon was going through a rough patch then.
He was. The Lost Weekend in L.A. happens in this timeline, too. Showing up to sessions late, erratic, clashing with Paul's desire for structure. Paul's quoted saying Lennon was either 100% present or completely somewhere else. Just hard to connect with consistently.
George was pulling back, too.
Yeah. He wanted to focus on his solo stuff after Material World, but felt obligated to these Beatles sessions. Starts skipping meetings, sending messages by letter, offers songs like Dark Horse that he also wants for his own record, which annoys Paul. He just resents the old dynamic. That quote captures it. I'm a Beatle when they need me, otherwise I'm just me, and I prefer me.
Paul was the one pushing for another album.
Seems like it. He wanted a proper follow-up to the '71 Record Clean commercial. But the others just weren't there, so he ends up trying to drive it himself, making demos, writing parts, booking studio time for these winter tape sessions.
Did they actually finish anything?
Some stuff. Maybe 6 finished tracks, 8 others started. Sources mention Paul's Letting Go, a George song called Steel and Sky, a rough Lennon track, Night Telephone, an unfinished group thing, Ashes Back to Rain, but mostly it just stayed in the vaults. Paul eventually gets disheartened and shifts back to his solo work by mid-75.
Ringo's role in this, The Last Bridge.
Trying his best. Laying down drum tracks, offering his own songs like Goodnight Texas, trying to get them together. But he sees it's not happening. He calls it the end without the funeral.
So the 1975 album just dissolved.
Never materializes. No big announcement, no drama. Just becomes clear it's not working. Apple shells the tapes, saying they may be released later. It becomes this mythical ghost album. Bootlegs surface eventually.
But no big breakup fight.
No villain this time. Not Klein, not Yoko, not egos clashing violently. Just a long, slow fade. Entropy. Silence. Maybe even relief. They grew apart, but maybe more naturally. They didn't break up in the explosive sense. They just drifted.
So that brings us to the end of the 70s, around 1980. What's the picture then in this alternate world?
They're not making music together. Not because of anger or lawsuits, just because they'd reached the natural end of that road as a band. It wasn't an abrupt cutoff, it was a quiet stopping. No sense of betrayal. They'd evolved from pop stars to architects to, now, cultural elders. Not really a band, more like a shared memory, still walking around.
And their individual lives look quite different, especially John Lennon's.
Yeah, the sources paint a picture of a quieter, longer life for him. He never fully cuts ties, but he retreats in the late 70s. Gets back with Yoko after the Lost Weekend phase ends around late 75. They move to Reykjavik, Iceland. He writes, records sparsely, walks around without bodyguards.
And he releases an album in 78, Northern Lights.
Described as really spare meditative. Doesn't sell massively, but gets huge respect in certain circles. No interviews, a quiet masterpiece. His quote about not doing Beatles stuff anymore, because we already said what we had to say, anything else would be noise. He just lives quietly. And crucially, he's alive in December 1980.
Wow. Paul keeps going, though.
Never stops. Records steadily as Paul McCartney and Friends. Gentle albums, Weatherproof Heart, Harvest Clock, Midnight Isle full of melody, texture. They chart, maintain a loyal audience. He tours occasionally, smaller places. Focuses on the studio, maybe mentoring. Matures gracefully in the public eye without the pressure of leading wings.
George turns further inward.
Yeah, after the 75 sessions, fizzle. Releases modest, respected solo albums via Apple Golden Thread, One Candle Left. Deeply personal, lots of Indian influence, gospel touches. Tours more like a cultural ambassador. With Ravi Shankar in 77, his concerts are reviewed in serious magazines. He becomes this quiet, almost prophetic figure.
And Ringo.
Stays busy, stays Ringo, records lighthearted albums, often with George or Paul popping in. Sunny Days Ahead in 77 even has a track pieced together through the mail with the others. He's just this beloved public figure. Documentaries, voice acting, touring with his own bands. The steady human reminder of what they were.
So by 1980, they haven't done a Beatles album in years, but they're still everywhere.
Completely. Catalog reissues, university courses study them, hip-hop artists sample them, punk reacted to them. They're just part of the cultural atmosphere. Not dominating, but structuring.
And the ending is so different. No final split.
John Lennon is alive, walking by the sea in Iceland, maybe sketching something to send to Paul. They never have that final dramatic breakup. No big farewell, no anthology project to wrap it all up, just memory. Echoes. 4 guys who changed the world, and in this timeline chose to just keep living in it. Not as legends frozen in time, but as people.
That's quite a journey we've taken following these sources. From the very real, complex reasons they broke apart to this imagined path of just gradual drift.
It really highlights how, according to this material, one key shift, Lennon suggesting a break, not a divorce, and a few subsequent choices, like neutral management, using Paul's solo stuff collaboratively, could have steered them away from that explosive end, towards something slower, quieter.
It completely changes the meaning of their ending, doesn't it? It's not this big defined moment. It's a shift into separate lives, held loosely by that cooperative structure.
And it makes you think, doesn't it, about how things end. Creative projects, partnerships, does it always have to be a crash? Or can things evolve, transform, fade more naturally?
Yeah, and that final idea from the sources is powerful. They endured not as gods, but as architects. Their influence is just woven in, nothing left to prove. They became this shared memory still walking around.
What does that kind of legacy mean?
Yeah.
One built on quiet continuity instead of loud rupture.
And what does it mean when giants don't fall, but just shift, evolve, and become simply people? That's definitely something to think about after this deep dive.
Maybe, somewhere out there, in a universe forever just out of reach, 4 lads from Liverpool never laid down their guitars. Maybe John's voice still cracked jokes between verses. Maybe George's strings still hummed secrets we never got to hear. Maybe Ringo's snare still kept time for a world that needed a little more time. And maybe Paul's pen never ran dry. But here in our universe, the story ended when it did. And in that ending, we got solo dreams, fragile and raw, music pulled from the splinters of something once whole. We lost so many songs that might have been, and yet we gained so many that could only exist apart. That's the thing about what ifs. They remind us that loss and gain are just verses in the same song. So wherever you are tonight, on a rainy street, an open road, or a quiet bedroom, play a Beatles record, and maybe just for a moment, you'll hear that other band, the one that never broke up. Thanks for wandering through this timeline with us. If you liked imagining the world that almost was, don't forget to subscribe to Glitchology and check out our sister channel, Strange Oil, for more stories that slip through the cracks of reality. Until next time, keep wondering.